Hello, learners, and welcome to the 48th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. In the previous lecture, I ended by describing the stamp collection as an important piece of information for the scholar Sara Wasserman and generally an important signifier of how the 20th century American novel treats the collectors of this kind of irrelevant or discardable or dispensable things, and through its description of these individuals ends up producing a different mode of perceiving these things. So the earliest example of this kind of literary phenomena Wasserman cites is from Theodore Dreiser's novel Sister Carrie, and this is a moment when Caroline Meeber comes to Chicago for the first time. And I don't think it's incidental that Illinois is featuring as a kind of a recurring thread throughout this conversation. Illinois and Chicago was among the earliest industrial hubs in the development of the United States. So it's bound to feature in these early moments. So this is how Theodore Dreiser writes, describes Caroline Meeber's entry into Chicago and the importance that pieces of and scraps of dispensable paper, which will not be dispensed with, however, will play an important role in Caroline Meeber's life. When Caroline Meeber boarded the afternoon train for Chicago, her total outfit consisted of a small trunk, a cheap imitation alligator skin satchel, a small lunch in a paper box, and a yellow leather snap purse containing her ticket, a scrap of paper with her sister's address in Van Buren Street, and $4 of money. Wasserman writes, that scrap of paper, a seemingly insignificant detail, grows in importance while Carrie, and now this is Dreiser again, Carrie looked at that little slip bearing her sister's address and wondered as if the slip itself contains all the mystery and danger of the approaching city. So the point here is that for the protagonist, Sister Carrie, the scrap of paper, and there will be more such scraps of paper, they signify something very, very ordinary, very, very commonplace. That is to say, everyone who comes to Chicago, from wherever they're coming from, whatever they're wanting to do, wherever they're wanting to go, will probably have some such scraps of paper. But for the protagonist, for Sister Carrie, that scrap is not simply a scrap of paper. It grows in significance. It becomes a momentous carrier of meaning and value. It plays an important role because it reminds her that this is how she had arrived in Chicago. This is how she had taken this chance to realize the many ambitions, dreams, and her desire for growth. All of that was compressed into this small scrap of paper. Now, there are several such individuals who feature in the 20th century American novel. Wasserman's claim is that the novel describes a dialectical process by which things that are meant to be discarded are produced in the first place. That is, scraps of paper on which the details of a train ticket or a bus ticket or a restaurant bill or a grocery bill are printed. They are printed or they are manufactured to be discarded. That is to say, once the train journey is over, that piece of paper has no value, has no place. There's no reason for anyone to preserve it, and the only logical place for that train ticket would be the garbage bin. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story, and which is more important for the novelists, is that for individuals, these tickets, these scraps, are actually very, very important. In fact, they begin to live precisely in that moment when they become dispensable. That is to say, after the train journey is over, Sister Carrie has no obvious need to preserve that ticket. But it is exactly at that moment when there is no material need to preserve that ticket that it grows in importance as a marker of the emotional trajectory, or at least the particular emotions and the particular mental state in which she was in when she was beginning or had begun this trajectory. This is a process that Sara Wasserman calls the ephemeralization of things. Ephemera is a word that Wasserman takes from the Greek and breaks down its Greek origins. It comes from two Greek words, that is, the first Greek word is epi, and the second word is hemera. Epi means upon or on, and hemera means day. The word was initially used to describe short-lived plants and flowers which would bloom with the rising sun and would die out or fall off as soon as the sun set. So the things that had a life which was dependent on other time-sensitive and short-lived things. Ephemeral things is easy to understand, things that have a short life. But for Wasserman, what is more important, and I think it's very relevant for our study of housekeeping, is not just the fact that some things are ephemeral, but the fact that the novel, through its description of people and things, creates the conditions for the creation of a newer kind of ephemera, a newer, longer-lived kind of ephemera. And the example we can understand this from the example of Sister Carrie. The stubs of the train ticket and the piece of paper on which Sister Carrie has written the address of her sister. These things come to have a very long life for readers of the novel because of the way Theodore Drazier has described them in the novel. So this aligns with Wasserman's claim that ephemeral things which are preserved in museums or in other forms of memorialization, such as the work of historians or other archaeologists, the frequent narrative about the preservation of ephemeral things is that they would have been discarded, but they ended up surviving by accident. Wasserman changes this narrative, argues that ephemeral things do not survive because they happen to miss the destructive force, or they've somehow escaped destruction, or it was not chance that led to the survival of things. Rather, it is care. And care is an important word. I'll talk more about care when I read a longer quote from Housekeeping very shortly. But Wasserman's claim is that things survive and we become aware of the ephemeral nature of things not because someone forgot to throw them, but because someone remembered to keep them. And this is the key difference. Remembering to keep something that must be or should be, or it seems to everyone else that it must be discarded. This is the key difference. For Wasserman, the 20th century American novel is like a person who cares for things that its characters care for, and instead of discarding them, by describing how characters hold on to things, the novel itself becomes an archive or a museum of these things which may have been discarded. So what are these things? Stamps are one common thing, but stamps are only the most visible ephemeral things. It is through the description of characters who collect stamps and who preserve stamps that the American novel sheds light on a whole host of other things which are ephemeral, but whose ephemeral nature becomes perceptive and we are able to perceive that ephemeral nature because of the way the novel describes how characters engage with them. And what is this nature of engagement? How do characters engage with ephemeral things, and how does the novel describe this engagement, which preserves these things? That engagement is dialectical. It is dialectical because these characters end up possessing these things because someone else has discarded them or has deemed it cheap enough to allow these characters to have these things because there's not much value. The value of a train ticket, if you think about it, is minimal. It is negligible. The only reason a person carries a train ticket is so they can demonstrate that they've actually paid the fare. And as soon as the journey is over, that ticket has zero value. This is one half of the story. Characters refuse to let go, refuse to discard these things. And it is the combination of both holding on to the train ticket while the journey is underway and refusing to let go of the train ticket days, months, weeks, years after that train journey is over, and undertaking the labor of care which is required to keep preserving, to keep holding on to that train ticket. This is, in a nutshell, this is how the novel describes characters. And in this history of the American novel, of the 20th century American novel, Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson is a very unique and powerful document because it does not simply describe women doing what men were doing. Rather, it describes how when women are called on to engage with things in this dialectical manner, it sheds light on a whole host of other things. So, when the gendered nature of domestic life in 20th century America is combined with the dialectical nature of things in modernity, the result is a very poignant examination of what it means to live, what it means to have an existence, what it means to have a past, and what it means to realize that past as being confined to a particular place. So, the place in which Ruth and Lucy live is a town called Fingerbone in the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. It's typical small town America. It's post war small town America. The life is determined by a church and sheriff and a small group of people who are suspicious of things they don't understand, right? And so when Ruth and Lucille and Sylvie, when these three women begin to demonstrate a not normal, a not conventional engagement with housekeeping, they are they are seen as somehow abnormal or not fitting in. So they receive a lot of criticism from the townspeople, and this culminates in two things. The two sisters, Ruth and Lucille, end up taking diametrically opposite positions with regard to the labor of housekeeping and the expectation that because they are women, they must keep house. Lucille, she goes in one extreme when she moves in with a home economics teacher, while Ruth, she faces the threat of abandonment from home and town. And this is when Ruth and Sylvie decide to set fire to their house and strike out for a life on the road. So between the beginning of the novel, which I read out in the previous lecture, and this moment when two of the sisters, they take these diametrically opposite positions and decisions on the burden of performing this labor that is placed on them and without ever asking what they would like. Between these two poles, we can understand the thematic trajectory of what this novel is tracking. And because the novel begins with a description of three generations of women living in one house, one after the other, and some of them failing to care and some of them staying on. And because the novel ends with both the sisters leaving that home and one of the sisters burning the house down and leaving with one of her aunts, the novel has been read rightly, but I think somewhat excessively, and I'll explain that, as a kind of advertisement or a kind of poster child for the great American feminist novel. Now, the great American novel is an intellectual category. It's an intellectual tradition. For a lot of scholars, and I think Lawrence Buell might have first written about it, this goes back to Herman Melville's Moby Dick as a very, very big novel, a very long novel, but also concerned with some very obscure but very real professions, activities, laboring realities. whaling, right? So whaling in New England, right? This small whaling ship that leaves Nantucket. It drills down on this very obscure but very real profession, and the novel itself becomes sort of like a dissertation or almost like a report on each and every material detail, and what that means for the people laboring in it. Material detail of the whaling industry, the whaling ship, its economy, the relationship between the workers on the ship, and so on and so forth. Moby Dick has exerted a very long and dark shadow on the 20th century, and many scholars have resisted it and have tried to go beyond it. Unfortunately, attempts to go beyond or to add new candidates to this title of the great American novelist, or attempts to diversify identity categories of this label, have actually reinforced the category in the first place. As you can tell from my label for Housekeeping, it can be called the great American feminist novel. I'm not very comfortable with that label, but I use it to shed light on how many 20th century scholars have read this as a great American feminist novel. There have been resistances to the great American feminist novel as being male. In that conversation or in that trend, Housekeeping is a welcome and refreshing breath of fresh air. Most frequently, and in a very comedic vein, there was there was a TV show, and I think it was on Netflix, which there's this moment in the chair when a group of undergraduate students some of them are not happy with being forced to read Moby Dick. They decide to perform a song as part of their assignment, and the song is No Women on Board. So, in a way, if one carries forward that tendency to think of the great American novel as a space that excludes women, then Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson completely reverses those terms, because it seems to create a space that is reserved solely for women, or at least a space where men seem to not be able to stay for too long. In fact, not only men, but even women seem to disappear from this house, as the opening paragraph makes clear. The opening paragraph suggests that women have either died or fled, or in other ways left, disappeared from this house, so that at the point that the novel begins, Ruth and Lucille are entrusted to the care of one aunt, Sylvie. Women have died, fled, or escaped, and these are the only women who are left standing. This is how the novel begins. And because it ends with both the sisters leaving the house and one of them quite literally burning the house, the novel has been read as a somewhat polemical and in some ways sending a message or rewriting the great American feminist novel by restoring women to spaces from which they had been excluded. Now, it's possible to read Housekeeping as a transgressive text, but I think it is not the most profitable or not the most useful way of reading the novel. There is something known as the Bechdel test, which comes from the work of Alison Bechdel, the graphic novelist and humorist, who famously put forward this test for writing generally for stories and narratives if they feature women talking to each other about a topic that doesn't concern other men. And so, in this context, and I think this is part of the late 20th century American literary feminist theory, in this conversation, also Housekeeping functions as a very good example, because it would very obviously and quite powerfully pass the Bechdel test. Nonetheless, if one focuses very carefully on scenes of housekeeping, descriptions of housekeeping, one will find that a lot of American feminist literary critics who have championed this novel as a rejection of patriarchal and masculinist separations or sexist separations between spaces inside and spaces outside. That patriarchal or masculinist separation sounds and can be summarized thus: that men have expertise in the public realm and women have expertise in the private realm. So the domestic space is a space where women, through their labor, because they are naturally inclined to it, would take care of the home, and men would take care of the public affairs. A lot of feminist critics have read Housekeeping as a novel that directly challenges and rejects this kind of a separation between public spaces as patriarchal and domestic spaces as feminine. However, if we read a description, and I'll just do that now, we'll find that the refusal to housekeep, the refusal to perform the labor of housekeeping, the rejection, saying, "No, I will not keep house." This gesture, which the novel describes very lovingly and which is performed by Sylvie and Ruth, we cannot very simply compartmentalize this gesture as a rejection of patriarchal norms or as an acceptance of a feminine or feminist refusal to care. In fact, the novel asks us to think about what it means to refuse to care. In fact, what looks like a refusal to care or a refusal to do the work which would make the house look like it is being cared for, what looks like a refusal may in fact contain in itself forms of care. And finally, in the final instance, we can never know for certain why Ruth or Sylvie says no to the act of caring. And in fact, the novel is not an ending but a beginning. The novel asks us to pay attention and to ask questions about why we want women to do something and why some women would not do that thing. It's not possible beforehand, before perceiving, before paying attention to the dialectical engagement with things, to know why a particular woman might refuse the labor of keeping a house. Okay, I'll read this section now. It's from page 85. This is Ruth describing Sylvie. "I remember Sylvie walking through the house with a scarf tied round her hair, carrying a broom. Yet this was the time the leaves began to gather in the corners. They were leaves that had been through the winter, some of them worn to a net of veins. There were scraps of paper among them, crisp and strained from their mingling in the cold brown liquors of decay and regeneration, and on these scraps were sometimes words. One read, 'Powers meet,' and another, which had been the flap of an envelope, had a penciled message in an anonymous handwriting, 'I think of you.' Perhaps Sylvie, when she swept, took care not to molest them. Perhaps she sensed a Delphic niceness in the scattering of these leaves and paper, here and not elsewhere, thus and not otherwise. Thus finely did our house become attuned to the orchard and to the particularities of weather, even in the first days of Sylvie's housekeeping." I think this is an extraordinary passage. I think it's remarkably powerful and poignant. It describes a woman walking with a scarf tied around her hair and carrying a broom, ostensibly to sweep the dust or to sweep things out of the house, to keep the house clean by removing things, right? This can be seen as a kind of 1950s or 60s, much more analog version of something that I find quite automated in something that's maybe Marie Kondo writes. So this kind of minimalistic approach of throwing things away if they haven't been used in a year, we find the exact antithesis of that here. So what is Sylvie doing? She's walking around with a broom, she's sweeping things, but as Sylvie sweeps and walks, Ruth watches. This is already a novelistic moment. It is already a scene of description that engages with someone else, dealing with the dispensability of things as well as holding on to things. So what are these things which must be dispensable? Leaves that had been through the winter. So leaves that have blown into the house, stayed in the house through the winter, and are now worn to a net of veins. An incredibly detailed image, an arresting, almost poetic image, almost like something from early 20th century American romantic poetry. There were scraps of paper which were crisp and strained from their mingling in the liquors of decay and regeneration. So, again, an increasingly poetic image. Papers, scraps of paper, they they seem to be wearing out, they seem to be crumbling, but that process of crumbling is also described as a kind of regeneration. So, if a paper crumbles, what does it regenerate into? That is the question that the narrator and Grace asks the reader to ponder. Some of these are advertisements, some of these are stickers, covers of books, wrappers of objects. Some of these are letters. It seems there's a piece of paper with the words, I think of you. Sylvie's probably received it from another person and she's kept it. The point is, Sylvie sweeps and takes care not to molest them. And we are given an interpretation of why Sylvie sweeps but does not sweep out these things. Sylvie, Ruth feels, senses a Delphic niceness in the scattering of these leaves and paper, here and not elsewhere, thus and not otherwise. So, in the particular order in which this house is untidy, Sylvie would like to preserve some of that untidiness. And Sylvie wants to do this because, like a Delphic oracle, right? She has a vision, like a prophet of the future. She has a vision that if the untidiness of the house is removed, then the inhabitants of the house would be impoverished in some way. The house would be worse if it were cleaned in a more conventional sense. So there's an effort to curate some of the mess or dirt or things that typically a person sweeping the house would sweep out. And this can be a familiar experience to everyone when they see the house being cleaned or vacuumed. Things fall out of pockets from underneath pillows or between cushions. Things like receipts, bills, tags from new things, new clothes. And there's that moment when everyone watches these fragments or these scraps being swept away into the vacuum or swept with a broom into the garbage bin. And it's in that moment Sylvie decides not to throw things but to keep them. She would like to preserve the house in a way that connects to some part of her identity. And so the mess and the dirt of the house is not simply something to be cleaned, but as a marker, as a symbol of the emotional state that these two individuals were in as they were living their lives. I'll stop here and continue this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you.